Hi, I'm Jack, and I want to share my story with you. A story about my journey with the English language. You see, I wasn't always comfortable with English. In fact, there was a time when it felt like a mountain I could never climb. Growing up, English was always something distant to me. I remember sitting in school, watching my classmates answer questions in English, while I sat there, wishing the teacher wouldn't call on me. When I heard people speaking English, it sounded like a string of confusing words, all jumbled together, too fast for me to catch. It was like trying to understand a code that I didn't have the key for. But deep down, I knew that English was important. I had dreams, big dreams. I wanted to travel, to meet people from around the world, to have a career that I could be proud of. And for all of that, English was essential. But I have to be honest with you, it scared me. The thought of speaking in English, of possibly making mistakes, made me feel small, insecure, and at times even embarrassed. But I didn't want my fear to control my life. I knew that if I wanted to achieve my dreams, I had to face this challenge head on. I couldn't let my struggles with English hold me back. So I made a decision. I would learn English no matter how hard it seemed. I didn't have a clear plan at first, but I knew that I had to start somewhere, and I was determined to make progress, one step at a time. Now, here I am, sharing my journey with you. I'm not here to tell you that it was easy, or that I've become perfect in English. But I have come a long way, and I want to share what I've learned along the way. I hope that by telling my story, I can help and inspire others who are struggling with the same challenges. Learning English has been more than just about mastering a language for me. It's been about growth, about pushing myself beyond my comfort zone and discovering new possibilities. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. This is my journey, and I hope that in hearing it, you'll find the motivation to keep going on your own path. We all start somewhere, and if I can make progress, so can you. Let's dive into the story, and I hope it resonates with you as you work towards your own goals. Let me take you back to the beginning of my journey with English. It wasn't an easy start. In fact, it was full of struggles, frustrations, and moments when I seriously doubted whether I could ever learn this language. When I first started learning English, I felt like I was trying to navigate through a thick fog. Everything seemed unclear, and I had no idea where to begin. The grammar rules were a mystery to me. I couldn't understand why some words had to be placed in a certain order, or why some sentences seemed to follow rules that were completely different from my native language. It felt like I was being introduced to a completely new way of thinking, and it was overwhelming. Vocabulary was another huge hurdle. I remember flipping through English dictionaries, trying to memorize lists of words, but they just wouldn't stick. Every time I learned a new word, it seemed to slip away just as quickly. I would sit down with a list of vocabulary words, repeat them to myself over and over again. But when it came time to use them in a sentence, my mind would go blank. It was as if the words were hiding from me, just out of reach. And then there was pronunciation. Oh, the pronunciation. English pronunciation was perhaps the most frustrating part of all. The same letter could be pronounced differently depending on the word, and there were so many sounds that just didn't exist in my native language. I would try to mimic what I heard, but when I spoke, it didn't sound right. I could see the confused looks on people's faces when I tried to speak English, and it only made me more self-conscious. I remember practicing in front of the mirror, trying to get the sounds just right, but it felt like my mouth just wasn't made for those sounds. The more I tried, the more I felt like I was failing. These struggles made English feel like an impossible task. I was surrounded by people who seemed to speak it so effortlessly, and I couldn't help but feel envious of them. They would converse in English with ease, while I stumbled over even the simplest sentences. It was disheartening. Every time I tried to engage in a conversation, I felt like I was on display. My mistakes and mispronunciations laid bare for everyone to see. It made me want to retreat, to avoid speaking English altogether. But deep down, I knew that avoidance wasn't the answer. My confidence took a hit. There were days when I questioned whether I was smart enough to learn English. It seemed like no matter how much effort I put in, the language just wouldn't click. I would sit in English classes, trying to keep up with the lessons, but the more I listened, the more lost I felt. It was like trying to run a race when you're already miles behind everyone else. I knew that if I wanted to succeed, I had to find a way to push through these challenges, but at the time, it felt like an insurmountable task. So, what kept me going? Why didn't I just give up and accept that English wasn't for me? The answer lies in what motivated me to learn English in the first place. I've always been a dreamer, and I've always had a vision of a life that goes beyond the boundaries of my hometown. I wanted to explore the world, to see new places, and to meet people from different cultures. But I quickly realized that without English, these dreams would remain just that, dreams. English is the language that connects people across the globe, and I knew that if I wanted to turn my dreams into reality, I had to learn it. Career opportunities were another major motivator. I knew that being proficient in English would open doors for me professionally. Whether it was landing a better job, being able to communicate with international clients, or simply being able to access more resources and information, English was the key. I didn't want to be limited in my career options because of a language barrier. I wanted to be able to compete in the global job market, to advance in my career, and to achieve the success that I knew I was capable of. But beyond the practical reasons, there was something deeper that motivated me to learn English: personal growth. I've always believed that learning is a lifelong journey, and I wanted to challenge myself, to push beyond my comfort zone, and to see what I was capable of. Learning English was more than just acquiring a new skill. It was about proving to myself that I could do it. It was about breaking through the mental barriers that told me I wasn't good enough, and showing myself that with hard work and determination, I could achieve my goals. There was also the simple desire to connect with others. I wanted to be able to understand and be understood by people from different backgrounds. I wanted to share my ideas, to listen to others, and to engage in meaningful conversations. English was the bridge that would allow me to do that, and I was determined to cross it, no matter how difficult it seemed. One of the moments that really solidified my motivation to learn English was when I had the opportunity to travel to an English-speaking country for the first time. I was excited, but also incredibly nervous. I knew that I would have to rely on my English skills to navigate this new environment, and the thought of it was both thrilling and terrifying. But it was during this trip that I truly realized the importance of English. I saw how it opened up doors for communication, how it allowed me to connect with people who I wouldn't have been able to speak to otherwise. It made the world feel a little bit smaller, a little bit more accessible, and it gave me a taste of what was possible if I could master this language. That trip was a turning point for me. It made me more determined than ever to learn English, because I saw firsthand the opportunities it could bring. I realized that if I wanted to live the life I had always dreamed of, I couldn't let my struggles with English hold me back. I had to keep going, no matter how difficult it seemed. So, with these motivations in mind, I set out on my journey to learn English. I knew it wouldn't be easy, and there were plenty of times when I felt like giving up. But I kept reminding myself of why I was doing this, of the dreams I had, of the career I wanted, of the personal growth I was striving for. And every time I felt like I was hitting a wall, I would think about those things, and it would give me the strength to keep going. Looking back, I'm glad that I didn't give up. My journey with English has been full of challenges, but it's also been full of growth and discovery. I've learned so much about myself along the way, and I've gained skills that have opened up new opportunities for me. And while I still have a lot to learn, I'm proud of how far I've come. If you're struggling with English right now, I want you to know that you're not alone. I've been there, and I know how hard it can be. But I also know that with determination and persistence, you can overcome those challenges. Keep reminding yourself of why you're learning English, and let that motivate you to keep going. It's a journey, but it's one that's worth taking. And remember, every step you take brings you closer to your goals. As I continued my journey with English, I quickly realized that if I was going to make any real progress, I couldn't just rely on the few hours of lessons I had each week. I needed to take control of my own learning and find ways to immerse myself in the language as much as possible. That's when I started exploring self-education, and it became a critical part of my learning process. I began by diving into English books. At first, it was overwhelming. Reading in English felt like running a marathon when I'd only ever walked a few miles. I started with simple books, the kind written for children or beginners, because I knew that if I jumped straight into complex novels, I would only end up frustrated. These books might have seemed too easy for some, but for me, they were perfect. They helped me build a foundation of vocabulary and grammar in a way that wasn't too intimidating. I remember the first time I read a book in English from cover to cover. It was a small, easy read, but to me it felt like a massive achievement. Each page turned was a victory. Each new word learned was a step forward. It was slow going at first. I would have to stop frequently to look up words I didn't know, and sometimes I'd have to reread sentences multiple times to fully understand them. But the more I read, the easier it became. My vocabulary started to grow, and I began to recognize sentence patterns and grammar structures. Reading became one of my favorite ways to learn English because it allowed me to see the language in context, which was something I struggled with when just memorizing words from a list. In addition to books, I turned to online resources. The internet is an incredible tool for learning English, and I found countless websites and platforms that offered lessons, exercises, and tips. I signed up for language learning websites where I could take quizzes, practice vocabulary, and even engage in conversations with other learners or native speakers. These websites became a daily part of my routine, and they allowed me to learn at my own pace. I also discovered language learning apps, which were a game changer for me. These apps made learning English more accessible because I could practice anywhere, anytime. I would use them on my commute, during breaks at work, or even just before bed. The apps often used a gamified approach, which made learning feel more like a fun challenge than a chore. I particularly liked the apps that focused on vocabulary and sentence construction because they provided immediate feedback, helping me to correct mistakes on the spot. It was through these apps that I learned how to structure sentences more effectively, and they helped reinforce the grammar rules that I was struggling with. One of the most important aspects of my self-education was consistency. I made it a point to engage with English every single day, even if it was just for a few minutes. Whether it was reading a few pages of a book, completing a lesson on a language app, or watching a video in English, I knew that every bit of practice counted. Over time, I started to notice the results. Words that used to confuse me became familiar, sentences started to make sense more quickly, and I felt less intimidated by the language. While self-education was crucial, I also knew that I needed formal education to truly master English. There's only so much you can learn on your own, and I needed the guidance of experienced teachers to help me understand the more complex aspects of the language. I decided to enroll in a local English language course. This was a big step for me because it meant committing to regular classes, homework, and tests. But I was ready. I knew that if I wanted to improve, I had to invest in my education. The course covered all the fundamental aspects of English: grammar, vocabulary, listening, speaking, reading, and writing. It was a comprehensive program that challenged me in ways I hadn't been challenged before. The first few weeks were tough. I found myself struggling to keep up with the pace of the lessons, especially when it came to grammar. English grammar is notoriously difficult for non-native speakers, and I was no exception. The rules were confusing, and there were so many exceptions to every rule that it felt impossible to keep everything straight. But my teachers were patient and supportive. They encouraged me to ask questions, to practice as much as possible, and to not get discouraged by mistakes. One of the most valuable parts of the formal education process was the opportunity to practice speaking English in a structured environment. In class, we were often paired up with other students to have conversations, and while it was nerve-wracking at first, it was also incredibly helpful. These conversations helped me become more comfortable with speaking English out loud, which was something I had always struggled with. It was during these practice sessions that I realized how important it was to get out of my head and just start talking, even if I wasn't perfect. The more I spoke, the more confident I became. The course also provided me with structured writing assignments, which was another area where I needed improvement. Writing in English requires a good understanding of grammar, vocabulary, and sentence structure, and it was something I knew I needed to work on. The assignments forced me to think critically about how I was using the language, and the feedback from my teachers was invaluable. They helped me identify my weaknesses and gave me specific strategies to improve. Over time, I noticed that my writing was becoming more coherent and natural. In addition to the language course, I also attended workshops and seminars on specific aspects of English, such as pronunciation and business English. These workshops were shorter and more focused, allowing me to hone in on particular areas where I needed extra help. The pronunciation workshops were particularly beneficial because they gave me targeted exercises to improve my accent and clarity. I learned how to use my mouth and tongue differently to produce sounds that didn't exist in my native language, and while it was challenging, it made a big difference in how I spoke. Of all the things I've learned on my journey with English, perhaps the most important lesson is the value of practice and persistence. Learning a new language is not something that happens overnight. It requires consistent effort, and there will be times when it feels like you're not making any progress. But it's in those moments that persistence is most important. I made it a point to practice English every day, whether it was reading, writing, speaking, or listening. I knew that the more I engaged with the language, the better I would become. Practice wasn't always easy or fun. There were days when I didn't feel like studying, when I was frustrated by my mistakes, or when I was simply too tired. But I kept going because I knew that every bit of practice was bringing me closer to my goal. One of the ways I kept myself motivated was by setting small, achievable goals. Instead of focusing on the overwhelming task of becoming fluent in English, I broke it down into manageable steps. I would set goals like learning a certain number of new words each week, completing a chapter of a book, or practicing speaking for 30 minutes a day. These small goals gave me something to work towards, and each time I achieved one, it boosted my confidence and motivated me to keep going. Persistence was especially important when it came to speaking English. Speaking is one of the hardest parts of learning a new language because it requires you to think quickly and respond in real time. There were many times when I stumbled over my words, made mistakes, or felt embarrassed by my pronunciation. But I knew that the only way to improve was to keep speaking, even when it was uncomfortable. I practiced with anyone who would listen, friends, teachers, even strangers. The more I spoke, the more comfortable I became, and over time, I started to notice that I was making fewer mistakes and speaking more fluently. Persistence also played a key role in overcoming setbacks. There were times when I felt like I wasn't making any progress, when I would make the same mistakes over and over again, or when I would forget words that I had just learned. These moments were frustrating, and it was tempting to give up. But I reminded myself that setbacks are a normal part of the learning process, and that every mistake was an opportunity to learn. I learned to be patient with myself and to see each setback as a stepping stone towards improvement. In the end, it was the combination of self-education, formal education, and relentless practice that allowed me to make progress in English. It wasn't always easy, and there were plenty of challenges along the way. But by staying persistent and committed to my goals, I was able to overcome those challenges and continue moving forward. Looking back on my journey, I'm proud of the progress I've made. I'm not perfect in English, and I still have plenty to learn, but I've come a long way from where I started, and if there's one thing I've learned, It's that with the right mindset and a willingness to put in the work, anyone can learn a new language. It takes time, effort, and a lot of practice, but the rewards are worth it. If you're on your own journey with English, I encourage you to keep going, to stay persistent, and to believe in yourself. The challenges are real, but so are the possibilities. Learning English was not always a smooth journey for me. There were times when the frustration felt overwhelming, and I questioned whether I could ever truly master the language. I vividly remember one of those moments when I was trying to write a simple email in English. I had been studying for months, yet when I sat down to write, I couldn't find the right words. The sentences were jumbled, my grammar was all over the place, and I felt utterly defeated. I remember staring at the screen, feeling a mix of anger and despair. How could something as simple as writing an email be so difficult? There were many days like this when the progress felt slow, almost non-existent. I would spend hours trying to understand a particular grammar rule, only to find myself making the same mistakes repeatedly. Sometimes, I would listen to native speakers and feel as though I was leagues behind, barely understanding what they were saying, let alone being able to respond fluently. The gap between where I was and where I wanted to be seemed insurmountable. In those moments, it was easy to feel discouraged. There were times when I seriously considered giving up. I would think to myself, maybe English just isn't for me. Maybe I should focus on something else. But every time I felt like quitting, I reminded myself of why I started in the first place. I wanted to open up new opportunities for myself, career-wise, socially, and personally. I wanted to travel, meet new people, and understand the world in a different way. Those motivations kept me going, even when things got tough. To overcome the frustration, I developed a few strategies. First, I learned to take breaks. When I felt overwhelmed, I would step away from my studies for a bit, allowing myself time to recharge. It was important not to push too hard, because that only led to burnout. During these breaks, I would do something enjoyable that didn't involve English. Whether it was going for a walk, listening to music, or just relaxing. This helped me return to my studies with a clearer mind and renewed energy. Another strategy was to celebrate small victories. I realized that I was too focused on the end goal and wasn't giving myself credit for the progress I was making along the way. So I started acknowledging the little wins, like learning a new word, successfully completing a grammar exercise, or having a short conversation in English without stumbling. These small achievements gave me the confidence to keep moving forward. I also sought out encouragement from others. I talked to friends who were also learning English, and we shared our experiences and frustrations. Knowing that I wasn't alone in my struggles made a big difference. We encouraged each other, celebrated each other's progress, and provided support when things got tough. This sense of community was invaluable in helping me stay motivated. One of the most important lessons I learned on this journey was that mistakes are not failures. They are learning opportunities. In the beginning, I was terrified of making mistakes. I thought that every error I made was a sign that I wasn't good enough, that I would never be able to speak English fluently. This fear held me back in so many ways. I was hesitant to speak up in class. I avoided practicing with native speakers, and I shied away from writing anything more than a few sentences. But over time, I realized that this fear was only hindering my progress. Mistakes are a natural part of the learning process. In fact, they are essential. Every mistake I made taught me something new. For example, I remember repeatedly confusing the words advice and advise. I used to get so frustrated when I made this mistake in conversation, but instead of dwelling on it, I decided to look it up and understand the difference. By actively learning from that mistake, I finally got it right, and now I never confuse those words. There was another instance when I misunderstood the use of certain prepositions. I kept using in when I should have used on, especially when talking about dates and times. It was a small mistake, but it was a recurring one. Instead of getting discouraged, I started paying extra attention to how prepositions were used in the materials I was reading and listening to. I practiced with examples, and gradually, I became more accurate. It was a process, but each mistake brought me one step closer to mastering the language. I began to embrace mistakes as opportunities for growth. Instead of fearing them, I started to see them as clues, signals pointing out the areas where I needed to focus more. When I made an error, I would take note of it and then go back to review that particular concept or rule. This approach turned what used to be a source of frustration into a powerful tool for improvement. Mistakes also taught me to be patient with myself. Learning a new language is not a linear process. There will be ups and downs, and progress will not always be visible right away. I learned to trust the process and to understand that with each mistake, I was getting closer to my goal. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about making progress. Over time, this shift in mindset made a huge difference. I became more confident in my abilities, less afraid of speaking up, and more willing to take risks. I started to engage more actively in conversations, knowing that even if I made mistakes, I would learn from them and improve. This confidence also made learning more enjoyable. I wasn't constantly worrying about getting things wrong. Instead, I was excited to see how much I could learn and how far I could go. Looking back, I can see that overcoming obstacles was a crucial part of my journey with English. The frustration, the mistakes, the moments of doubt, they were all part of the process. They challenged me, pushed me out of my comfort zone, and ultimately made me a better learner. If there's one piece of advice I would give to anyone learning English, it's this: don't be afraid of mistakes. Embrace them, learn from them, and keep going. Every mistake is a step forward, and with persistence, you will reach your goals. After months of dedication and hard work, I started to notice small but significant changes in my English skills. The first moment I truly felt I was making progress came during a conversation with a friend who was a native English speaker. We were discussing our weekend plans, and for the first time, I could follow the conversation without feeling lost. I didn't need to ask for repetitions or explanations as often as I used to. I could understand what was being said and respond appropriately. It was a simple, everyday conversation, but for me, it was a major victory. I remember feeling a surge of confidence. This was the moment I realized that my efforts were paying off. Another milestone was when I successfully wrote an email at work without needing to ask for help or second-guessing myself. I remember sitting at my desk, drafting the email, and then rereading it to make sure everything was correct. To my surprise, the sentences flowed naturally, the grammar was correct, and the message was clear. I hit send with a sense of accomplishment that was hard to describe. It was a small task, but it represented a huge leap in my confidence and abilities. That day, I felt like I had crossed an important threshold in my English learning journey. These early successes were incredibly motivating. They reassured me that I was on the right path and that with continued effort, I could achieve even more. They weren't grand achievements by any means, but they were milestones that marked my progress and gave me the encouragement to keep pushing forward. As my confidence grew, so did my ambitions. I started setting higher goals for myself. Where before I had focused on basic conversations and simple emails, I now wanted to tackle more complex aspects of the language. I aimed to speak more fluently, participate in deeper conversations, and write longer, more detailed texts. One of my new goals was to hold a conversation with a native speaker on a complex topic, such as current events or cultural differences. This required not only understanding the language, but also being able to express nuanced ideas and opinions. I began practicing by listening to podcasts, watching news programs, and engaging in discussions online. I started to challenge myself by speaking on these topics whenever I had the chance. At first, it was difficult, and I still stumbled over words or struggled to find the right expressions. But with each conversation, I became more fluent, my vocabulary expanded, and my ability to articulate my thoughts in English improved. Writing was another area where I wanted to see growth. Initially, my writing was limited to short emails or basic notes, but I wanted to do more. I set a goal to write longer, more complex pieces, essays, reports, and even short stories. I knew this would require a deeper understanding of grammar, a richer vocabulary, and the ability to structure my thoughts clearly and logically. I began practicing by writing daily, even if it was just a paragraph or two. Over time, I started to see improvements. My sentences became more complex, my grammar more accurate, and my ideas more coherent. The process was slow, but the progress was steady. One of the proudest moments of my journey was when I successfully wrote a detailed report for work, which was later praised by my colleagues. The report required careful attention to detail, clear articulation of ideas, and the ability to convey complex information in a straightforward manner. Completing it felt like a huge achievement, because it was something I couldn't have imagined doing when I first started learning English. It was a testament to how far I had come. My continued improvement wasn't just about learning more words or mastering more grammar rules. It was about growing as a communicator. I learned to think in English, to express myself with confidence, and to engage with others in a way that felt natural. Each new milestone, whether it was speaking more fluently, writing more effectively, or understanding a difficult text, brought me closer to my goal of mastering the language. These milestones were not the end of the journey, but they marked significant points along the way. Each one was a reminder of what I had achieved and a motivator to keep going. Learning a language is a continuous process, and I knew there would always be more to learn, more to improve. But these successes proved that I was capable of achieving my goals, no matter how challenging they might seem. They were the building blocks of my journey, each one contributing to the foundation of my growing fluency and confidence in English. The turning point in my English learning journey came during a business meeting at work. Up until that point, I had always felt a little apprehensive when using English in professional settings. I would carefully rehearse what I wanted to say in my head before speaking, and I often doubted my ability to communicate effectively. But this meeting was different. It was a critical meeting with international clients, and my boss asked me to present our latest project. Initially, I felt a familiar twinge of nervousness, but as I started speaking, something clicked. The words flowed naturally, and I didn't stumble or hesitate. I was able to explain our ideas clearly, answer questions confidently, and even engage in some light-hearted conversation with the clients afterward. As the meeting went on, I realized I wasn't just getting through it. I was genuinely contributing, and I felt comfortable doing so. The clients were impressed with the presentation, and my boss gave me positive feedback afterward. This was the moment I realized that I had crossed a significant threshold in my English learning journey. The fear and uncertainty that had always accompanied my use of English were gone, replaced by a newfound confidence. I wasn't just speaking English, I was owning it. This experience was transformative for me. It wasn't just about mastering the language, it was about believing in my ability to communicate effectively in English. For the first time, I felt that English wasn't just a skill I was learning. It was a tool I could use to achieve my goals and make an impact in my professional life. With this newfound confidence, I began to apply my English skills more actively in real-life situations. At work, I started taking on more responsibilities that involved communicating in English, whether it was writing reports, leading meetings, or negotiating with clients. I no longer shied away from opportunities to use English. Instead, I sought them out. Travel was another area where my English skills began to shine. I had always dreamed of exploring different countries, and now, with my improved English, that dream became a reality. On a trip to New York, I navigated the city with ease, interacting with locals, asking for directions, and even striking up conversations with strangers. I was no longer the tourist who struggled to communicate. I was confident and at ease, enjoying every moment of the experience. English had opened up a whole new world for me, and I embraced it wholeheartedly. Social settings also became less intimidating. I started attending more social events where English was the primary language, from networking events to casual gatherings with friends. I found myself engaging in deeper, more meaningful conversations, no longer worried about making mistakes or not being understood. Whether it was discussing a book I had read, debating current events, or simply chatting about life, I felt comfortable expressing myself in English. One of the most rewarding experiences was when I volunteered to help new English learners in my community. I joined a local language exchange group where people from different backgrounds came together to practice their language skills. I became a mentor to some of the newer members, sharing my experiences, offering tips, and helping them overcome their own challenges. It was a full-circle moment for me. I had gone from being a struggling learner to someone who could inspire and guide others on their own English learning journeys. These real-life applications of my English skills reinforced the confidence I had gained. I saw how far I had come and how much I could accomplish with my improved English. The turning point wasn't just about feeling confident in my abilities. It was about seeing the tangible impact of those abilities in my everyday life. English was no longer just something I was learning. It was a part of who I was, a skill that enriched my life in countless ways.